Welcome to the demonstration of the Environmental Enforcement Watch Project's Nationwide Trends in Enforcement and Compliance Over Time computational notebook. A computational notebook which anyone can access at the link above if they have a Google account, is essentially a data science tool that intersperses cells of text, such as this one that explains the licensing for this notebook and how it was authored, with cells of code, which we'll see in a second, that actually retrieve, process, and display data outputs. So in this notebook, we say a little bit about how to actually run it, and it is or can be as simple as pressing play on each of the cells of code. Now, there will be some options, as you'll see, for selecting different areas to analyze. But in general, a notebook, you're pressing play and retrieving data. Now, of course, if you have the programming background, you can manipulate this notebook and take it in different places. So this analysis is focused on nationwide trends in enforcement and compliance with environmental protection laws over time. So to what extent are state and federal EPA agencies enforcing things like the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System of the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, which manages toxic or hazardous waste? And to what extent are facilities regulated under those acts complying? So we're going to be looking at things like violations of those laws, inspections done of facilities under those laws, and enforcement actions levied against violators of those laws. So the first cell of this notebook essentially just brings in extra code to help us perform the rest of the analysis. And I've already run it for the purposes of this demo, but I'll run it again just to give you a sense of what it looks like to interact with a notebook. I'm simply pressing play, and it's doing the work of retrieving all that extra software for me. Now, in this notebook, we are loading data that has already been sort of pre-processed from another notebook, which I will show here for you. So we're loading in statistics from the past 5 years or so on the enforcement and compliance with environmental protection laws. Now, we develop these statistics, which you see here, through a comprehensive analysis of our database, our copy of the enforcement and compliance history online database in this notebook. So you can see this notebook is a little bit longer. There's longer cells of code. But what we're doing here is we're retrieving basically spreadsheets that tell us, okay, in this case, this is every regulated facility in EPA's database. We're summarizing how many facilities are currently or at that time, this is 2023, regulated under the Clean Air, Clean Water Act, RCRA, as well as reporting greenhouse gas emissions. We're looking at Clean Air Act inspections. So each row here is an inspection done in 2023 under the Clean Air Act or reported under the Clean Air Act. And we're calculating rates. So how many inspections? Okay, we have 37,000 here. Well, what does that mean out of every 1,000 facilities? So some basic math there. So that number is simply loaded in here. And then we analyze it in this cell. So by running this cell code, which I did with a keyboard command, Shift Enter, okay. But we can select the program. Okay. We'll start with the Clean Air Act and select the indicator that we want to look at. So one of the most important things that we think is the case when it comes to enforcement and compliance is understanding what Claire Ewing has called the violations pipeline. So we might be interested in understanding, well, who are the bad actors when it comes to, the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, whatever it might be. Well, one way to look at that is to look at violations of those laws, reported violations. The problem is that in many cases for certain programs, we only find violations when we do inspections. So we have to understand, well, how many inspections done by state, or in some cases federal EPA, how many inspections are being done? So we're going to look at these together. So we select both of these. And in this cell, then we printed a nice chart that shows us more about the data. So you can see here in the green bar, we have Clean Air Act inspections per 1,000 regulated or active facilities. So in other words, about 1 in 4 regulated facilities in 2019 received an inspection. That number has dropped over time. And if we went back further, although for various reasons we can't necessarily calculate that rate previously, but if we went back further, I think we would see that number, well, we would see it decline over even a longer period. Now, some of the 2023 numbers might be due to maybe not all the inspections have been filtered into the database yet, so we do have to keep that in mind. But generally, we do see somewhat of a drop-off. Some of it might be due to the pandemic as well, starting in 2020. And of course, not every inspection will find a violation. So we see here, okay, maybe about 20 violations per 1,000 facilities. But the point is that if we're not doing as many inspections, we may be less likely to find violations. Now, that is less true for the Clean Water Act. Let's take a look at that. So we go back up here, select the Clean Water Act, and then look at inspections and violations again. And so what we see here is actually quite essentially a sort of reverse trend, at least in terms of inspections versus violations. So we see fewer inspections, less than 200 per 1,000 facilities, a number that has also somewhat declined over time, over the past 5 years. But then we also see quite a high rate of violations. So basically over 1,000 violations per 1,000 facilities. And this is due to how reporting occurs in the Clean Water Act, where facilities are making electronically submitting discharge monitoring reports to state and federal EPA that then get basically checked against permit levels to see whether the facility has reported discharging above the permitted level. And so that can automatically flag violations, leading to higher rates. So you don't necessarily need the inspections as much, and we don't see them as happening as much. It's also worth looking at enforcement actions and penalties here. So we'll take a quick look at enforcement actions and see what that looks like. So we see, just given the high number of violations in the Clean Water Act that are in many cases being generated automatically, a very low rate of enforcement actions like penalties and written orders and whatever per violation. So 0.01 there. That differs if we were to look at the Clean Water Act, where we see actually, not quite 1 action per violation, but a lot closer. In other words, not every violation is going to get an enforcement action, but we're a lot closer in the Clean Water Act. Penalties per facility in violation. I'm not going to show this. I encourage you to explore it on your own time, but it is sensitive to large settlements made with egregiously violating facilities in different years. So it's really hard to look at trends in that. And if we can see that if we look at the max penalty here, where in 2023 there must have been some sort of settlement with a group of companies that led to a huge fine under the Clean Air Act. Finally, although there are no legal limits federally to greenhouse gas emissions for facilities. Many of them are required to report greenhouse gases to the EPA, and we can look at some of that information as well. So we look at emissions here. This is going to be total over the years for those facilities required to report, and we do see a general decline. In some years, perhaps due to the pandemic, steeper than others. And we also see, if I'm not mistaken, the largest emitters actually increasing. So although in aggregate emissions are coming down, the worst of the worst are maybe getting worse. So this is a very short notebook compared to some of what we've produced in the past, but this gives us a sense of not just facility by facility, what challenges and enforcement of and compliance with environmental protection laws might look like, but what this looks like overall across the nation. And in our next event in a couple of weeks, we'll actually break this down congressional district by congressional district. And this concludes the Nationwide Trends Over Time demo.